When people want to explore concepts of hegemonic masculinity, they don't usually say, "Let me explain this," using the analogy of a feral Canadian man stabbing cyborgs in his underwear. When they want to explore nationalism or racism or fluid sexuality, they aren't likely to say, "Okay, but imagine a sentient island on which people who can shoot lasers out of their face can be easily resurrected to have orgies in the hot tub." My point is that the metaphorical potential of the XMen depends on a level of elaboration that is beyond the norm, but no less effective. Plus orgies and cyborg stabbing. Socrates has nothing on those analogic vehicles. Oh, you came up with the idea of a cave to explain existence? My cave has margaritas and thruples. Sit down, Socrates. So today we're moving forward with our study of the superhero by looking at the concept of mutanity in the X-Men universe, which is a concept that's been very heavily discussed, even just in the last few years, and has become central to one of the best-selling comic series going right now, which would be the X-Men again. Now, I've mentioned to you guys before that I do have a whole lot of expertise in this, so this is a plug, shameless plug, let's say, for my ongoing project, which does Twitter microblogging and lots of data stuff and super exciting. Tell me I'm pretty, all that stuff. History. X-Men was first created in 1963 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who are the chief architects of Marvel Comics. It was not popular. It did not sell well. It was revamped in the late 1960s with a young Neil Adams, a very important comics creator. And it was a hit, but Marvel didn't know that until after they'd canceled it, which is kind of tragic for the reasons we talked about with the Superman thing, where they just didn't have good tracking infrastructure, let's say. Neil Adams quit and went over to DC to make Batman cool before they even realized that the X-Men was successful. Marvel then stopped paying for new issues, and for issues 67 to 93, they just reprinted old X-Men as like they were new issues. So imagine if you go to the store and you buy a DVD of Game of Thrones Season 7, and it's just Season 3. All the episodes are Season 3 episodes, and you're like, what? This is supposed to be Season 7. What's going on? That's what Marvel got away with, which I think is kind of funny. In 1975, the series was rebooted with a new creative team and a new team of X-Men. Chris Claremont was then brought on as lead writer, a position that he held for 16 years, the longest single author run in Marvel Comics history. Then in 1977, John Byrne joined up, and the popularity of the comic book surged. John Byrne, Canadian, by the way. From there, X-Men became the most popular comic in the world and absolutely dominated the comic scene for 20 years, and still holds a tremendous presence today, having featured notable runs by Grant Morrison, Joss Whedon, and Brian Michael Bendis, and now Jonathan Hickman. So the first X-Men film is also credited with initiating this era's superhero film fascination. So a really important market-dominating book for a long time. The original idea is the Avengers, but everyone hates them. So everyone loves the Avengers. They're great and they save people. What if they didn't, though? Here's Stanley. Instead of being lauded by the public, they'd be feared and hated and hounded and shunned. I thought it was an interesting concept. End quote. So like that's it, man. The Avengers, but nobody likes them. So racism surrounding mutanity was the way that they were able to accomplish that kind of incongruous feat. Because again, everybody seems to be totally okay with the Hulk. And he's scary as hell. But if it's a genetic mutation, I can't stand them. So yeah, maybe a little flimsy. A lot of people point out this is actually going to be one of the problems with integrating the X-Men into the Marvel Cinematic Universe for this exact same reason. There's an inconsistency there. Anyway, let's go to our layout a little bit later than normal. I thought we'd do a cover this time, just real quick, since we have a lot to cover. So this is the cover of Wounded Wolf. It's Wolverine. Now he's upside down and he's in this sort of very condensed, confined space. Putting him upside down makes you feel uneasy, makes you feel disoriented, and off balance and powerless, even though you've got those cool claws going and the sweet pecs and all that kind of stuff. And then you have the emphasis on like artificial and biological. So you have these really straight wires moving, at least on the top part, giving you the sense of, again, this artificial. You might have heard the expression, God doesn't paint in straight lines. They use it in the movie Prometheus, actually. contrasted with the rounded organic lines of Wolverine's musculature. And then underneath those severely straight lines, you get all these like winding cords representing sort of this interstitial space, that which is neither inorganic or organic, creating that sense of Wolverine's diminishing concept of his own humanity, which is of course a major theme throughout the story. I don't know, I guess I'll leave it with that, other than to say that the hand covers over the X-Men, which I think is kind of cool and dynamic and gives it that further sense of like 3D, like it's coming at you. Okay, so symbolism commonly associated with X-Men. There is the Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King comparison, that Professor X is Martin Luther King, advocating peace and integration, where Magneto is Malcolm X, advocating open hostility. That's a simplification. It's a massive simplification, and a lot of people really don't like that, but it's something that Stan Lee cultivated and later authors would incorporate as well. It's a big generalization, and sort of represents more how the media perceived Malcolm X and Martin Luther King than how they actually were. Nonetheless, there might be something apt in there. The idea of acceptable casualties versus moral authority comes sort of prepackaged with that. Is it okay to let people get hurt in sort of any sort of racial conflict, or even like self-defense? Or is your obligation to protect all beings and to have moral authority, which is to say to do the right thing? Then we have the idea of being the threat your enemy perceives versus demonstrating your benign nature. If someone comes at you with hostility, do you show them your hands to let them know that you're not a threat, so that there doesn't have to be violence? Or do you put up your fists in order to back them down because you'll stand up for yourself? These are the kind of questions that X-Men asks. There's also a major theme of optics, of manipulation and staging and fighting a war through public perception. A lot of what the X-Men do is specifically designed to let people know that mutants can be helpful too. And that's very much like a media war, something we see a lot of happening today, including on social media, actually. And then there's the queer allegory, which is referred to as queer mutanity by scholar Ramzi Fawaz, who won an Eisner Award for his book on the subject. Which basically, queer mutanity suggests that X-Men are a queer found family, represented sort of symbolically. That their outsider status reads as an allegory of being queer in our culture, and that therefore makes all the narratives spin around that in a kind of complicated way. There's a term called dog whistling. I don't really like that term, but what it refers to is a medium that is speaking directly to a queer audience whilst not openly acknowledging that they're doing so, and in many cases actually denying that they're doing so. So a good example would be like the BBC Sherlock TV series. Gets accused of dog whistling a lot. Queer baiting is another term. It's sort of related. It's not exactly the same thing. Not something we can fully get into today, but cool concepts you can look up. So here's scholar Scott Buchapman on X-Men. Buchapman thinks that X-Men are very unique as a book. He says this is where the body imagery comes in. X-Men are at odds with the taboo that their bodies create and project. So they're at war with their own bodies, right? Because their bodies isolate them in society by making them freaks, for lack of a better term. At the same time, the mutant body is the source of the fantasy. So there's a really cool paradox there. So your body makes you an outsider and makes your family want you to not live with them anymore, but your body also lets you shoot lasers out of your eyes, which is objectively cool. So there's a really cool kind of dynamic taking shape. Thus, X-Men characters become hyper-aware of their bodies and of the body's relationship to society. This hyper-awareness opens up the dominant metaphors that X-Men explores, such as adolescence, racial minorities, women in society. Buchapman also concludes that the X-Men are feminized because of their relationship to their body, suggesting that the superhero is an inherently masculine figure and that all the power and adoration that they get is a very masculine trait in a patriarchal society, and that the X-Men, whether male or female, are therefore feminized metaphorically. It's a complicated theory. Issues with Buchapman: he's generalizing 30 years of comic story as a singular entity, which is never good scholarship. And he also takes cheap shots at bodybuilding culture of the 90s, which I find really offensive, and we don't need to talk about it all. He just really doesn't seem to like bodybuilders. And I'm like, what's up, man? That's not cool. Be nice to the gym dudes. Anyway, so that's Buchapman's theory. Again, that X-Men is all about this sort of body horror, and that there's a lot of ways that it intersects with gender, race, sexuality, all that kind of stuff. So, X-Men also brings us outside of the individual superhero. This is a collective. Leading to a fun question: why are team-up stories usually, but not always, terrible? Maybe the Snyder Cut fixes this, guys. I don't know. I still feel justified in throwing shade at Justice League. So here's a quote I wrote about the Justice League movie in an article that I published. Writing a team superhero book is a very different beast than writing a superhero tale surrounding a singular character. The fundamental mechanisms by which we are made to empathize with a character and feel immersed in their struggles are different when we go from one person to many people. So you get things like distributed identification. So instead of identifying with Superman, you're picking which Ninja Turtle you identify with the most, or which Power Ranger you identify with the most. So the characters all have to be differentiated, and this means that your viewpoint character is going to be different depending on who the audience is. So if I'm a nerdy person, technologist, that kind of thing, yeah, Donatello, I'm going to identify with Donatello. But if I'm a type A athlete, really driven, I'm going to identify with Leonardo. So that actually means that the narrative is kind of choose your own adventure-ish automatically. Which character you identify with is very much going to alter your experience of the story. We see this in like Gilgamesh versus the Iliad versus the Odyssey. So we got Gilgamesh as a solo adventure in the back half, but it's also a buddy story in the front half. The Iliad is very much a team book. It's all the Greek heroes, Diomedes and Ulysses and Agamemnon and such. And then the Odyssey is just the story of Ulysses, so it becomes a sort of single superhero story. This leads to the concept as well of what's called the Gestalt protagonist. This means that you're not actually identifying with individuals in the team, you're identifying with the team. So the hero of X-Men isn't Wolverine or Cyclops, depending on your perspective. The hero of X-Men is the X-Men, seeing them as a cohesive identity, rooting for them, identifying with them, plural, which is, again, a very different dynamic. And you can see this argument in a lot of other places as well. I taught the Harry Potter course. One of the things that we argue there is that there's a Gestalt protagonist in that it's not really Harry who saves the day, it's Harry, Ron, Hermione, functioning as almost a singular person. And then Buchhatman talks about the armor of being a collective, the idea that people are, of course, safe and secure as a result of being in a group dynamic. Claremont himself, one of our authors for today, describes X-Men as a quest for family, particularly, as we said, found family. And Ramzi Fawaz suggested it's a queer found family specifically. So we got a lot of intersecting symbols going in a lot of different directions. If you're confused right now, good, you're supposed to be. X-Men is really robust for symbolism and openly contradicts itself pretty often, actually. So let's briefly look at our two creators. I'm going to focus on the writers on this one, just because that's the nature of our comparison. We're going to look at the writing strategies, but the artists on this one are just spectacular. So feel free to look them up on your own if you want to talk about them in an essay or something. I would love that. Chris Claremont is born in London in 1950, raised on Long Island from the age of 3, however. His family is Jewish, which informs the metaphor he constructs in X-Men. It's Claremont who turns it into more of a Jewish allegory specifically, whereas prior to that, it was mostly about the Civil Rights Movement. He studied poli-sci and acting at Bard College, got an internship at Marvel through his parents' connections, who were trying to keep him away from Mad Magazine due to the drug and sex culture there. They pushed him to Marvel instead. Made a name for himself very quickly. He was offered X-Men when he was 25 years old, which is very young, and that was a controversy amongst the bullpen. Why are you giving this kid his own book? Nonetheless, he quickly developed a reputation for intense artistic integrity and a genuine passion for his characters. This would ultimately be what got him fired. He was still the best-selling comics writer in the world 16 years later on the same book, but they fired him because he wouldn't jump through hoops in order to help them sell like action figures and stuff, which is kind of sad. Anyway. So Claremont is known for the long story. He popularizes the long continuous storyline and recursive storytelling structures. Prior to that, comics were very episodic, which is like each issue would be self-contained. You could pick up an issue, you could miss the next issue, and you wouldn't miss that much. You'd be able to get caught up real quick. Claremont doesn't do it that way. If you miss an issue of X-Men, you're missing a ton. Again, this is really analogous to contemporary media, such as binge watching, where you can't miss an episode of your favorite series in most cases without, completely screwing up the narrative. Again, TV wasn't like that for a very long time. And he had a direct inspiration on Joss Whedon's Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Whedon drew extensively from that, like really directly in some cases, in order to craft that story, which is considered the sort of origin point for continuous storytelling in TV, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So again, Claremont's fingerprints a little bit. Now, Jonathan Hickman. Hickman's born in 1972 in South Carolina. He holds a degree in architecture. He's worked as a cover artist, a writer, and even a comics columnist. So he's been covering like all aspects of the comics creator portfolio. He wrote a brilliant Fantastic Four run starting in 2009 that was really well received and has made his way around Marvel pretty much ever since. He's known for complex plots, transhumanist philosophy, and a general disregard for character. I say known for here because I'm not sure that's entirely fair. I'm a little on the fence on that one. People say Hickman doesn't write characters at all, he just writes stories. I don't think I agree with that. But anyway, his revival of XMen was met with controversy, but has been very widely studied ever since. There are people who don't like it, and I think it's just a case of XMen has always been a character book, so suddenly making it a plot-based book is jarring, but it's clearly doing cool things and asking cool questions. So again, I think Hickman sometimes gets unfairly attacked. At the same time, I'm not sure he's my favorite writer either, but that's a personal preference. Now, coming back to Umberto Eco. We talked about this before. The mythological character of comic strip finds himself in this singular situation. He must be an archetype, the totality of certain collective aspirations, and therefore he must necessarily become immobilized in an emblematic and fixed nature which renders him easily recognizable. This is what happens to Superman. But since he's marketed in the sphere of a romantic production for a public that consumes romances, he must be subjected to a development which is typical, as we have seen, of novelistic characters. So again, we need these characters to advance and change and evolve. Now, Claremont's original real-time version, or vision, I should say, for the X-Men was to actually have them age in real time. So every year of like comics publishing, the characters would be a year older. He also wanted them to die, to retire, to move on, and constantly bring in new talent to the roster. Marvel wouldn't let him do that for honestly sensible reasons. If you spend money cultivating intellectual property so that you can sell action figures, and then you kill the character, you can't sell those action figures. So, So for your study of the superhero, the long continuous story creates a broader canvas, allowing for more complicated, realistic superheroes. So coming back to one of the themes that we've been exploring already, death, we can do a lot with that in X-Men comics at this point in time. Though not established in the issue you read. It comes in earlier or later, I forget, because the story's all out of order. Anyway, the big development on Krakoa is that they can bring any mutant back to life. Like they're fine when they die, and they come right back. So there's an obvious connection there, kind of a simple one. But X-Men as a series is actually very notable for introducing the concept of the death of superheroes by accident. In the Dark Phoenix saga, a character kind of killed a planet by accident because they went evil for a little bit, and the editor said you had to kill the character. This is Jean Grey, Phoenix. This is, again, the Dark Phoenix saga. And they didn't want to do it, but they had to kill her anyway because of the editor, so they did. And then everybody loved it, and it became this sort of poignant story that opened the floodgates. And now every superhero book wants to kill their main characters because it sells a whole lot of money. Sells a whole lot of money. Sells a whole lot of issues, exactly as we saw with that Death of Superman that we talked about last week. So as I said, House of X, Powers of X, or HoXPoX as it's called, completely negates this, portraying a world in which death has no consequences. Now, Eco talks about how the world has to be relatable, and we've discussed this delicate balance. A world in which death isn't a thing is either a really good way to create false impressions of romance, because you get the tragedy of the character dying, but they're not actually dead, or it's a really good way to make the world completely unrelatable to a human being, because all human beings know that they will die. So there's a kind of a cool thing happening there. There's a lot that can be talked about there. And then on our issue, we have kind of a form of death, this like final judgment leading to a state of non-existence, in the form of Sabretooth, this bestial mutant guy, being sent to the center of the island in this massive abyss, which is kind of horrifying and very death-like in its symbolism, quite frankly. Now, on that same subject, we can talk about the Little Death, by which I mean Wolverine, not to be confused with Orgasm, which is the Little Death in Shakespeare. Wolverine brings death onto the team. He suggests that death is an acceptable form of superheroism because he kills. He uses lethal force as a tool of heroism. He's also a killer who has not been punished for his crimes. And then they kind of get around that. They say that, it was self-defense all the time. But there's a lot of Wolverine scenes where it's pretty clearly not self-defense in the past that he's killed people. So, yeah. Anyway, Wounded Wolf showcases this by giving us a story about Wolverine's past catching up with him, the sort of consequences of a life of violence, even when you're trying to stop that, even when you're trying to live a different, ideally better way. So you see Wolverine engaged in this struggle to sort of move beyond his past, but his past keeps catching up with him. The idea being that the cycle of violence is largely inescapable, or at least very challenging to escape. He kind of succeeds. I would argue he's not actually fighting Yuriko. He's fighting that cycle of violence. And the only way he breaks it, as we see in that kind of cool scene, is she begs him to kill her because that's what she wants. She's suicidal. She wants an honorable death. She wants to be set free. And instead of just being like, no, we're going to rehabilitate you, or instead of being like, stab, what he says is, you got to earn it. You're not deserving of this violent death, which is kind of cool. So Wolverine is an interestingly anti-macho character in comics history. He's very misunderstood. Everybody thinks of Wolverine as this like savage berserker character. That's actually who he was, who he is in Marvel Comics, at least during the Claremont run. And some authors have sort of forgotten about this. Is an anti-macho character. He doesn't want to be a berserker. He doesn't want to be violent. He wants to be sensitive and articulate and peaceful, and garden and wear kimonos, and all that kind of stuff. But again, he can't. And one of the reasons he can't is because his past keeps catching up to him, as we see in this. But the other reason is simple, like utility function. Wolverine is a superhero, but in order to help people, he kind of has to stab other people. That's his skill set, right? And a lot of times, as much as he would love to not be violent, his violence saves the X-Men. So he's constantly at odds with this aspect of his personality. And again, as I said, he's constantly trying to move away from the macho archetype that so many people love about Wolverine. They did a pretty good job of engaging with this in the Logan film, the last in the Wolverine film starring Hugh Jackman. But I don't know, basically the idea is that Wolverine would much rather be Hugh Jackman than Hugh Jackman's portrayal of Wolverine, if that makes sense. We had a cool contrast with Katie Powers in this one, who is this innocent young girl. She's what he wants to be. He wants to be innocent. He wants to not have to deal with this kind of crap. He doesn't want blood on his hands. So there's a really nice kind of back and forth there. As I said, past catches up, and he's looking for a better way. That probably covers it. It's a really good story, self-contained Wolverine story, but it showcases a lot of what X-Men is about challenging norms, challenging the archetypes and stereotypes by which we define different categories of people. And as I said, Wolverine's a strange example of that because he often gets misinterpreted as representing the very stereotype that he actively struggles with. It's his nemesis, this berserker, savage, clawy guy. That's not who he is. That's who he desperately strives not to be. Anyway, so then we go to Powers of X a little bit here. We get the concept of a mutant nation, which is really cool. This has been experimented with by prior authors before in the X-Men universe. There's like a storyline called Nation X where they basically get an island in the Pacific, which is actually very similar to this. And they try to just live there and declare it a sovereign nation. It doesn't go real well, as you might expect, because humans are jerks. But here, the major difference is the shift of power. So a lot of scholars have talked about this, and they say that what's sort of most interesting about Powers of X is the idea of, like, what if the minority group held power overnight? What if black people didn't have to petition for equal rights in society? They could just take them and have them instantly because they had power. And Krakoa has these drugs that they sell to the rest of the world. They have these superpowered beings occupying them. What if overnight the minority group could not be oppressed anymore, at least not the same way? There's also a very direct comparison to Israel being made extensively, and there's been some pretty cool stuff written about that, but very controversial, as you might imagine, as the Israeli state is a very controversial subject right now. I don't know, I don't really want to develop them anyway, so no sense sticking my hand in that bear trap. Now, juxtapositions. Powers of X highlights a transition between states. So we get these two stories, basically, two scenes, fundamentally. So the first scene is like a courtroom judgment-y thing. Hey, what do we do with this guy who keeps killing people? And is it a law against killing humans on Krakoa or outside Krakoa? Krakoan citizens killing people outside Krakoa? I don't know. I don't know their exact parameters. And then the other scene is just a party, just a massive party in which they're all having fun. And we'll talk about that in a second. And at the same time, we get a juxtaposition between duty and privilege. So the party is what you get once you suffer through the bureaucracy, once you make the hard decisions and draw the hard lines and debate and discuss. So you're getting this sense of like cause and effect, what you give up and what you get in return for it. And then along with that concept of suffering and joy, that they can have this safe haven once they get through the tough choices that they're making and, the punishment that they inflict on the dangerous members of their society. So there's a lot of really weird kind of like how to conduct a state ideas being explored in this text. And I think that's one of the reasons it's been picked up by so many like political scientists and scholars as a really cool thought experiment, whether or not you like the story. And then after that, related to that, we have the concept of like tortured mutant and happy mutant in the juxtaposition here. So we've got the current X-Men writer making a lot of headlines, and we've got the most famous X-Men writer of all time, one of the most famous comics writers of all time, considered one of the absolute best. And I'm not just saying that because I have a project going about him. Like his papers are literally archived at Columbia University. How many Ivy League universities have bought up the papers of comics artists that you know of? I'll help very few, like incredibly few. Anyway. So Claremont is famous for saying that his approach to the mutants in terms of making them sympathetic characters was to just absolutely torture them emotionally, physically, spiritually, constantly. If this sounds familiar, yeah, that's Shakespeare. That's the epic authors as well. I think Aeneas does a little better. No, he doesn't. He really doesn't. He suffers too. So it's kind of an easy way to create character, just constantly have them go through misery. Think through your favorite TV shows. They do that too. And then Hickman goes in the other direction. What if I could just show these characters having fun? What if I could give them a good, happy moment and make narratives out of that? And he kind of does. And it's sort of remarkable. It's unusual. Again, like every work we've studied so far, and we haven't studied a lot of comics, has been about characters suffering intensely. That's going to be a theme going forward as well, unfortunately. Hickman moves away from that in a kind of cool way. Anyway, so unconventional storytelling. We also have Wolverine in Hickman's run having a fine time. I do want to call attention to this because it's not an accident. It's something that's been discussed in the media. Hickman is portraying Wolverine, Jean Grey, and Cyclops, which is a very traditional love triangle in X-Men comics that Claremont actually established. And it's very sad, and they both love Jean, but she's attracted to one and loves the other, but can't really decide, and blah, 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 blah. Sad. So sad. And instead, he's just like, well, what if they just all hooked up with each other? So they're in a throuple. It's subtextual. They haven't acknowledged it openly. But the diagram that you can see in the middle, remember that Hickman is an architect, by the way. So he can do these kind of diagrams and not make mistakes. Shows the living arrangements in the Krakoa house. And what you'll see is that Cyclops, Jean Grey, and Wolverine have adjoining rooms. They're connected. Not an accident. None of the other pods have that. This is his way of saying they're in a relationship. It's a fluid sexuality. We also see this in our issue with some, let's call them telling glances between Emma Frost, the White Queen, and Jean Grey as she hands her a beer. Hickman is portraying a world in which the mutants are just freely exploring sexuality in a kind of polyamorous or polysexual society, which is controversial, as you might imagine, but I don't know, very contemporary and very progressive in contrast to earlier models of sort of binary sexuality, or essentialist sexuality, I guess I should say. So I think I'm kind of running out of time here. Let's maybe jump to discussion questions, and we'll be able to see a little bit more X-Men later. We're actually going to read more Claremont next class. Suckers, because he's the one I do my project on. Anyway, discussion questions. How does the idea of mutant nationalism strike you as a concept in a racialized world? How does the concept compare to modern issues of racial identity, racial injustice, etc., etc.? Is there anything valuable in Hickman's X-Men for us to take away, or does this fantasy world simplify complex issues beyond any practical application? It's a weird tenor coming back to weird vehicle coming back to our cold opening. We live in a world where there's a lot of racial strife going down right now, and the X-Men portray a sort of solution to it, at least for the mutants. How apt is that? What can you do with that? Is there any value to that? Or is this, again, kind of a gross simplification that we can't really do anything with? So I want you to think about that. If you're going to write about it, and I will see you on the next lecture.